Good morning, everybody. This is Dr. Hathcock, and today we're going to finish up World War II and do a review so that we can get you ready to take your exam. This lecture is going to cover Wednesday, April the 15th, or Thursday, April the 16th, depending on which one of my classes that you're in. And we're going to be taking exam 3 next Monday, Tuesday. It'll just sort of be due by Tuesday at 11:59 p.m., regardless of what class you're in. But I'll give more details through the announcement and things like that. Okay, so for today, we just need to finish up the war. Then we'll do a review to get you ready for exam number 3. All right, looking at letter K, the U.S. enters World War II. So last time we had the Japanese invading Pearl Harbor, doing quite a bit of damage, but only sent in 2 of the 3 waves. They called off the 3rd wave because they couldn't figure out where America's aircraft carriers were. And what we say of Pearl Harbor is it may have been a successful attack, but strategically it was a huge mistake for the Japanese to make because with that, now the United States is drawn into the war. And looking at the U.S. entering into World War II, total war basically means your entire economy is now about manufacturing what is necessary to win the war. Instead of making automobiles, a lot of those plants like the Ford assembly, General Motors, places like that, instead of mass producing cars, they're going to start making tanks, jeeps, transport vehicles, and things like that. Total war is about the people home in the United States making sacrifices for the war. You could only buy like so much meat per month. In fact, the government would give out this little coupon book to everyone, and you had to have your coupons to be able to buy so much sugar, so much meat, things like that. And during World War II, America's home front production was astounding. Our old assembly lines kicked up again. We started mass producing things again. This time, instead of mass producing consumer products, though, we were mass producing the weapons of war that would be needed in the fight to come. Japanese American internment is it's a it's a nasty little part of our history. But during World War II, there was this fear that some Japanese Americans were spies, that they were sending information back to Japan to hurt the U.S. war effort. And what happened with Japanese American internment during World War II is American citizens who happened to be of Japanese ancestry were rounded up. They were put into these internment camps. And I will say this, these weren't like the Nazi death camps that were happening in Europe. They weren't murdering people. But yes, during World War II, a lot of Japanese Americans, especially living out on the West Coast, they were put into these internment camps where they were made to live under guard, behind fences, things like that. It would take many decades later for the United States government to apologize for what happened here. But, you know, this is one of those nasty things that America sometimes does. A lot of times when we go to war, we kind of go crazy. We do things that later we regret. And this is a prime example of that. And looking at the role of women in World War II, women rolled up their sleeves and they went to work in America. There was this big campaign, this Rosie the Riveter campaign, to convince women to work in factories. It was kind of wasn't considered ladylike in the 1940s for a woman to work in a factory, and the government basically said, you know, ladies, y'all got to get over that quick because we need you to make those weapons of war. And I've always said that the role of women in World War II was absolutely critical to winning the war because really they are the ones that made the tanks, the aircraft, the machine guns that were used to win said war. And last lecture, I gave you that phrase that a lot of people say World War II was won with Russian blood and American manufacturing. So if that is the case, you can argue that women in America won World War II. They played a huge role anyway in the outcome of the war. Now, looking at the role of African Americans in World War II, The Tuskegee Airmen was this, they call it experiment carried out by the U.S. Army to see if African Americans could be fighter pilots. Sorry about that, my phone went off. Uh, Again, we're all just doing what we can here, right? Being flexible. But yes, the Tuskegee Airmen was this experiment by the U.S. Army Air Force to see if African Americans could be fighter pilots. It's crazy that they would talk in those terms. It was crazy that this was, quote, an experiment. But the Tuskegee Airmen proved themselves to be the equals of any other fighter pilots in World War II. The success of the Tuskegee Airmen program really opened a lot of doors for African Americans, not only in the military itself, but then also when World War II is over, you really start to see the dismantling of Jim Crow post World War II. And Tuskegee opened doors for African Americans to become officers in the military. That in turn starts to change many people's views of Jim Crow, of racism, of segregation. So Tuskegee was a huge success, not only in winning World War II, but also in winning the fight against Jim Crow when the war is over. Following your outline, the Red Ball Express was the supply line that kept the Allied advance going in Europe during World War II. The Red Ball Express was supply trucks. These transport vehicles were filled with gasoline, food, bullets, artillery shells, and this stuff needed to get to the front so that the Allied advance could continue on. And it was primarily African Americans that the Army used for driving those supply trucks to get those things that were needed to the front. When World War II was over with, Dwight Eisenhower, who's the leader of Allied forces in Europe, well, American and British forces in Europe during the war, Eisenhower said that the war could not have been won without the Red Ball Express, without those men risking their lives to get those supplies that were badly needed to the front. Lastly, looking at the role of Native Americans in World War II, they, like everyone else, stepped up to do their part to help win the war. In particular, you have the Navajo Code Talkers. This is a group of Native Americans of the Navajo tribe who worked with the Marine Corps in the Pacific during World War II. I've never studied Navajo myself, but apparently it's a very hard language to learn, even for linguists. It's like unless you've grown up in the culture, Navajo is very hard to understand. So these Navajo code talkers would use their language to communicate back and forth. And the Japanese never cracked this code. They never understood what the Marines were saying across the Pacific. So the Navajo code talkers saved a lot of American lives during World War II as well. What I've always said about this slide, the U.S. enters World War II, I've tried to always put it this way. It took every man, woman, and child, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, in the United States, coming together to win World War II. Because for America, it was a total war effort. And for America, it was a war on two fronts. Moving on here to this Grand Alliance, the United States had to fight a global war in the Pacific and in Europe at the same time. Historically speaking, it's very hard for a country to win a two-front war, especially on a global scale like this. But yes, the United States was the one nation that had to fight on both fronts at the same time. Really, the British, their colonies are going to help us in the fight, like Australia, for example. But really, for the British, the fight is in Europe. It's against the Germans. The same is true for the Russians. Really, their fight is against the Germans. In Asia, the Chinese, their primary goal is to fight the Japanese. So America was the one allied power that was fighting on both fronts at the same time. Now, looking at the big three, the big three refers to the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union or Russia. And they are the big three nations of the Allied powers. They're the ones that are going to do the heavy lifting. They're the ones that are going to make the big decisions. So anytime you see that phrase, the big three, it's referring to the United States, England, and Russia. It's also used to describe the three leaders of those countries. The big three can also be Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. So there were some 20 odd nations that were a part of the Allied powers, but really it was the big three that were making the big decisions, the tough calls, bringing the most to the table. Well, when this Grand Alliance was created, once the United States got into the war and joined the Allied powers, they agreed on certain conditions for ending this war. One thing that the big three agreed on in particular was that Germany would be invaded before World War II was over. There was a feeling among the Allied powers that Germany got off easy at the end of World War I, which is kind of an insane argument to make, but anyways, they did. And the feeling was that if Germany had been invaded in World War I, that is to say, if they had faced war on their home country, if they had tasted the devastation up front, they wouldn't have had the stomach for World War II. They wouldn't have been so cocky and arrogant to go off and fight. So one agreement the Grand Alliance had was Germany will be invaded before this war is over. It was also agreed by the Grand Alliance, the Allied powers, that there would be no separate peace made. That is to say that the Japanese, for example, they can't contact the Russians and try to negotiate a separate peace with them. No, the Allied powers stand firm, they stand strong, they stand together, and they're not going to make a separate peace with the Germans or the Japanese. All of the Allied powers have to agree before there will be peace, before the war comes to an end. Okay, well, one of the major conferences of World War II happened in Tehran. And as I was explaining in a previous lecture, you need to know your World War II conferences. Tehran is a big conference that's held by the Allied powers. And just one more time as a side note here, again, the Axis powers aren't holding these conferences. Well, they did it in Munich, but that was before the war started. But the Axis powers aren't talking strategy. They're not sitting down to discuss the next phase of the war, what's the next big move. And I told you guys that one reason why the Axis powers lost is they didn't talk strategically. And one reason why the Allied powers do win is they do talk strategy. And that really comes through here with this conference that's held in Tehran in November of 1943. Now, the purpose of Tehran, the whole reason for meeting, was to discuss the possibility of opening up a Western front in Europe. At that point, by November of 1943, the Russians have stabilized their front with the Germans. I wouldn't say the Russians are winning at that point, but they've sort of stalemated the German advance. And Stalin really needs the United States and England to enter into the war. And at Tehran, this big conference, this meeting of the big three, what happens there is Stalin asks the United States and the British to open up a Western front in Europe. And what we say about Tehran is the Tehran conference is going to lead to D-Day. It's going to lead to that opening of the Western Front. Well, at that meeting in Tehran in November of 1943, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agreed with Stalin's assessment that the United States and the British did need to open a front, a Western front, that is to say, in Europe. What's really being talked about here is crossing the English Channel and invading France. And the idea behind this is the Americans and the British will hit the Germans from the west, while at the same time the Russians will hit the Germans from the east, forcing the Germans to fight a two-front war there in Europe. And if successful, if the West can open up that front, then you've got this power coming from two sides on the Germans. And the idea is you just crush them like a can from both sides. Then the phrase of the war will be meet you in Berlin, buy you a beer as the war is over. Franklin Roosevelt agreed that the United States and the British did need to open that Western Front, but he said they couldn't do it there in the winter of 1943. It's cold, it's too much to ask of men that they would fight in those conditions. But President Roosevelt, before he left Tehran, he assured Joseph Stalin that in the spring, the United States and the British would cross the channel and they would open up that front Stalin was calling for. At Tehran, Stalin was very happy to hear that the United States was going to try to open up a Western Front in the spring of 44. So he promised that once he heard that the cross-channel invasion had taken place, that the Russians would fire up their war machine in the east, putting pressure on the Germans there. So one more time, you have the Americans and the British coming in from the west. You have the Russians coming from the east. The idea is you crush Germany like a can, hitting her on both sides. And at some point, the powers will meet in Berlin, buy each other a beer, because at that point, the war would be over. So Tehran specifically led to the D-Day operation that'll eventually take place on June the 6th, 1944. What is known as Operation Overlord, or D-Day, is the cross-channel invasion from England into France in 1944. Now, what has to take place here in D-Day is the Americans and the British are going to have to cross the channel, the English Channel, and attack northern France, which by this point is being referred to as Fortress Europa. The Germans at this point have had 4 years to beef up the defenses in northern France. They've put in a lot of steel reinforced concrete bunkers. The Germans have mines along those beaches. They have these massive anti-tank things set up. And the Germans have been bracing themselves for this possibility of a cross-channel invasion. And Fortress Europa is basically the defenses that the Germans have put into northern France, getting ready for this attack. Sometimes when I lecture, I can spend 30 minutes on D-Day. Truth be told, I can spend a whole day on D-Day. But I just don't have that kind of time. We've got to kind of wrap this up as the semester itself is winding down. But D-Day was this very elaborate plan of attack by the Allied powers to get their forces onto those beaches in northern France, and thus creating what's called a beachhead, this sort of a staging point, if you will. And it took a lot of creativity, a lot of time, a lot of espionage or spying, if you will. But the D-Day operation was extremely complex. Paratroopers were used. If you look on this map, you can kind of see these airplanes really off to the far left, kind of off to the far right. Paratroopers, guys jumping out of airplanes, if you will. They crossed the channel at midnight, June 6, 1944, in the morning of June 6, 1944. And they were paradropped behind enemy lines. And the whole point of the paratrooper operations was to get the Germans to look back rather than towards the beach. They wanted them looking backwards, thinking that the attacks were taking place there. So paratroopers were heavily involved in this. The role of the Navy was twofold. Number one, the Navy had to transport all those troops across the channel, but also the Navy was there to provide cover to fire on those beaches, if you will. Air power was used that day as well to drop bombs along the beach front to try to cripple the German defenses that were there. But air power had a really hard time that day. It turns out it was very cloudy in the skies over Europe, specifically over northern France. Most of the aircraft, when they dropped their bombs, they either dropped them too soon or too late. So air power really didn't do its job. It's not their fault. It's the weather. But this big plan put into motion all these different things with paratroopers Here we have I'm sorry, president. He'll later be president. At this point, he's a general. Here we have General Eisenhower talking to the guys of the 101st Airborne Division on June 5. Literally just hours after this talk, these guys will be getting into the back of aircraft and paradropping into northern France later on that day, actually that next morning. Let's see, a lot of deception was used that in the lead up to the D-Day attacks. The Germans thought there was this massive army that was massing up at a place called Calais. So what the U.S. Army did is they had these fake tanks. You see this one here on the top left corner. It's a balloon. They put up a lot of these balloons, and the Germans would think all these tanks were massing over there. This transport vehicle that you see in the top right is a balloon. And if you're a German airplane and you're flying high above the sky and you're sort of spying on southern England, from way up there, this stuff looks like it's real. Bottom left hand corner, you see a fake airplane that was made out of wood. But again, when the Germans flew overhead, took those pictures, they thought it was real. Bottom right, these were dummy paratroopers that when they landed, I would set off a mechanism and firecrackers would start going off. So German soldiers thought that these were real paratroopers firing machine guns, when in actuality they were just letting off firecrackers. Again, if I had more time, there's a lot to be told there. It's some really fun stories, but we got to move on. But all that stuff, the paradrop operations, the use of air power, it really all comes down to this. It's about those men getting out of those transport vehicles and attacking that beachhead there in Normandy. These guys were, there was a lot asked of these men. They were weighed down with well over 100 pounds worth of equipment. As soon as those boys hit that water, the 100 pounds felt more like 400 pounds on their backs. You can see they had to wade their way through the water. Eventually, they would reach the beach. And then it just depended on your landing site. But for most of those guys, they would have to cross roughly 400 yards of terrain before they could even reach where the Germans were and begin to fight back. All the while, they're facing machine gun fire, pre-sighted artillery. You never knew when you took a step if it was a mine and it would explode. And there was a lot asked of these guys here on D-Day to storm those beaches and try to capture northern France. But at the end of the day, D-Day was a successful operation. Operation Overlord did take place. It was victorious. And with the amphibious assault, an amphibious assault is basically going from water to land. What the Allies have done at that point is they've captured these beaches in northern France. And in this photograph, this is why D-Day matters. This is why victory had to be achieved. Because now the Americans and the British have a way to get all their troops, all their weapons of war, all their transports into France. And now you can start the liberation of France, and in a larger picture, the liberation of Europe, with the success of the D-Day invasion. So this picture right here is worth a million words. This is what it's all about. Victory meant that now they could pour all their military assets into France, and it is the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. With this, you have the opening of a Western Front. The Russians way off to the east, they hear of the success of the Operation Overlord landings. The Russians fire up their war machine in the east. The Americans and the British are hitting hard in the west. So one more time from this point on, the phrase of the war is, meet you in Berlin, buy you a beer, because the war is over. Now I'm going to go ahead and make that our phrase of the day. What the heck? If you could send that to me in an email, remember to use the my.tccd.edu email. Be sure you put your section number. It's I don't know, it's not that hard, but it's kind of difficult when you're trying to count everyone's attendance to be flipping through classes and figure out what class is a student in. Please do give me your section number as well when you send me that. Again, the phrase of the day is, meet you in Berlin, buy you a beer, because the war is over. All right, so with this Western Front, the Germans now have to face a two-front war. for what's left of World War II. Well, 1944 turns out to be a pretty big year for the Allied powers. That same day, June 6, 1944, while the D-Day landings are taking place, Rome is actually captured on June 6, 1944. And the Italians in that summer of 1944 will be completely taken over by the Allied powers. Once Italy is securely in Allied hands, the Italian people will then ask to join the Allied cause, once again stabbing their allies in the back, this time at the end of World War II. So Italy will join the Allied cause with what little is left of the war at that point. In 1944, France will be liberated, primarily by the U.S. Army, but England played her role as well. But yes, France will be liberated in 1944. And in the East, the Russians are winning. The Russians are pushing the Germans further and further back in the East, so that by the end of 1944, Germany is surrounded on all fronts. The Americans and the British are to the west, the Russians are to the east, and at that point, by the end of 1944, it's almost over. There's not much fighting left to be had, but at the end of 1944, the winter kicks in, the snow begins to fall. The Allies just sort of take up their positions along the German border, and they're going to wait till the winter is over with and invade in 1945. But while the snow was falling and while the winter was kicking in, the Allied powers met in a city called Yalta to hold a major conference of World War II. And the whole point of the Yalta conference is to figure out what Europe will look like when World War II comes to an end. Yalta is a huge moment in human history, not just in the history of World War II, but in human history. And I've already told you that World War II conferences are something that you should know, that you should highlight, star, smiley face. I would especially say that of Yalta as well, because not only will Yalta be on your third exam, Yalta will also be on your fourth exam as well. It really is just this huge moment that takes place here in February of 1945. Okay, well, Yalta is about post-war plans. And again, following along with your outline as I go to the pictures here, this is a huge meeting of the big three. We have Churchill on the far left. We have Franklin Roosevelt there in the middle smoking a cigarette. And we have Joseph Stalin there on the far right. And at Yalta, these three would sit down and basically decide the fate of Europe for, roughly about the next 50 years to come. Okay, and looking at these post-war plans for Europe, let's start by looking at the decisions that were made for Germany at the end of World War II. The big three decided that Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation. And Germany itself would be sort of busted up. Excuse me. Germany itself would be busted up into 4 zones of occupation at the end of the war. And here we go. Let's see. You can see in this little map that we have here that there's going to be a British zone. Specifically, look up in the top right-hand corner there. There's going to be a British zone of occupation. There will be a very small French zone of occupation. But there would also be an American zone of occupation, as well as a Russian or Soviet zone. So one decision that's made for Germany at the end of World War II is she is going to be broken up into 4 different zones of occupation, with these major Allied powers controlling each zone. This was meant to be a short-term thing. This was really just until things were stabilized and they felt like Germany could be reunified. But what was meant to just be temporary would actually last some 45 years going forward. So one agreement that is made is that Germany itself will be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Another decision that was made at Yalta was the capital city of Berlin would also be divided into 4 zones of occupation. And you can see Berlin sits squarely in the Soviet zone. But yes, the capital itself was also going to be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Same countries. There'd be a British, a French, an American, and a Russian zone of control there in Berlin. Again, this was meant to be a temporary thing, maybe a year, but some 45 years later, Berlin would still be divided along primarily those same lines. Okay, some more decisions that were made for Germany when the war came to an end. When this war is over with, the Allies are not going to ask for money. You might remember at the end of World War I, there was that $33 billion that the Germans were going to have to pay. It held Germany back, during those tough times. So this time, instead of asking for money, it's agreed at Yalta that the Allied powers are going to steal technology from the Germans, and that this stealing of technology is going to be sort of their repayment for the war. And boy, the Allies are going to steal some pretty big things from Germany at the end of the war. For example, the Germans were the first ones to figure out how to invent a rocket. They used a lot of these so-called V2 rockets during World War II. They didn't really have a guidance system. They weren't accurate at all. But the Germans were the first ones to figure out rockets. And yeah, the Americans will do their best to capture as many Nazi rocket scientists as they can. The Russians will do the same. So yeah, they're going to capture V2 rocket technology, the scientists who were working on that technology. Also, the Germans were the first ones to figure out how to make a jet engine work. So the Americans and the Russians will start stealing jet aircraft. They'll not only steal the jet engines themselves, but the scientists who invented those engines. So like as Germany is collapsing, these are very valuable things to get your hands on, the scientists, the technology, and things like that. Also, the Germans were the first ones to figure out something called an assault rifle. And the Americans will steal assault rifles, will figure out how they work, make their own. The Russians will take German assault rifles, figure out how they work, go on to make something called the AK-47 using that technology. So yeah, a lot of technology, science is going to be stolen from the Germans here at the end of World War II. Okay, in looking at decisions for post-war Eastern Europe, and sticking with the map here, if you think about it, this war started in Poland with the German invasion of Poland. And what the Americans and the British really wanted was for Eastern Europe to have what's called self-determination. That is to say, allow Eastern Europe to decide for itself what it wants to be. If the people of Poland want communism, then okay, fine, they can say that. But if the people of Poland want democracy, they should be allowed to say that as well. So, in looking at the big three, United States, England, Roosevelt, Churchill, they're asking that Eastern Europe be freed at the end of World War II and be allowed to self-determine what kind of government they want. But at Yalta, Stalin made it very clear that those things were not going to happen. And Joseph Stalin told the Americans and the British that he was holding on to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. And in that moment, a crack begins to form in this alliance. Stalin's demand that the Russians be allowed to hold on to Eastern Europe causes mistrust amongst the big three and the Allied powers. In that moment, the United States and the British see the Russians as, greedy, aggressive, someone who can't be trusted. And what you can say about this is the Cold War started at Yalta, and the Cold War started with Stalin's decision to hold on to Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. So Stalin is the one really who triggers the Cold War to come and what's going to be. Okay, I was trying to get my slides to go back. They won't. So we'll just carry on. Again, I'm hoping you have your outline with you. Let's see some other decisions that were made at Yalta. It was agreed at Yalta that the United Nations would be created, that it would be based in the United States in New York City. And the League of Nations was sort of like a precursor to the UN. But this time the United States will be involved. And yes, so there is an agreement at Yalta that the United Nations will be created. at the end of this war. And one last thing that was thrown in, the Russians did agree to help the United States in their fight against Japan. We had this Russian pledge to fight Japan, sort of the last point there on Yalta. But the thing about that Russian pledge was the Russians said that once Germany was defeated, then they would help the United States in the fight in Asia against the Japanese, but not until Germany was defeated, would the Russians be involved. Well, as Yalta was breaking up and the big three were headed home, turns out that was the last time those three would be together and talk and meet. Not too long after that, just a few months later, President Roosevelt would die. Winston Churchill would be voted out of office as Prime Minister of England. But hey, when you're a dictator, you get to stay around till you're dead. And Stalin would continue to be the leader of the Soviet Union. But Yalta was the last time that the big three met face to face. Okay, now going on to letter P, ending the war in Europe. There was this one last desperate attempt by Hitler to try to salvage the situation in Germany. And this is referred to as the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the Battle of the Bulge took place because we didn't know that Hitler was going crazy at this point. We thought that Germany was, in some ways, being led by a sane leader. But it turns out Hitler was losing his mind at the end of World War II. His empire that was supposed to last 1,000 years was crumbling just a decade later. He wasn't sleeping well at night. He had developed something called hypertension. Hypertension is where your muscles shake uncontrollably. You can't stop it. In fact, the only way they could stop his hands from shaking was by giving him doses of opium. So not only is Hitler losing his mind, but he's hopped up on opium here at the end of World War II. But Hitler believed that he could muster together what little the Germans had left and throw it all into the West against the American and British forces. And Hitler believed that Germany could drive the Americans and the British back into the ocean by launching a massive attack to the West. And what happened is the U.S., the British, it's wintertime. A lot of the soldiers who have been fighting to that point were given rest and relaxation, R&R. A lot of those guys were recalled back to Paris or to London to take a bath, eat a hot meal, feel human for a moment. And they replaced a lot of those veterans who had been fighting the war to that point with raw recruits arriving from the United States. These guys are kind of green. They're not experienced. They don't know what they're doing necessarily. So you've got a lot of replacement troops along the front. Again, American and British leaders believed it's wintertime. The Germans won't fight in the snow and the ice. We're just going to relax, control this line, wait for the spring to arrive. But yeah, they didn't know that Hitler was losing his mind. And Hitler decided to invade to the west. And ultimately, it did create a bulge in the Western Front. It was sort of a situation where it was bending in the Western Front, the line itself. But what happened was American forces were caught off guard. They were surprised, and that's why the Germans were able to have any level of success there. Also, what helped the Germans was it was very cloudy in the skies over Europe in those moments. So it was hard for the U.S. Army Air Force to come in and give ground support. So the element of surprise combined with the weather, it did lead to some German success at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. But very quickly, once everyone realized that the Germans were launching an assault, the front began to harden. A lot of those guys who had been recalled for rest and relaxation were immediately recalled and sent back to the front. So the Allied lines held in the West. This so-called Battle of the Bulge was not ultimately a success for the Germans. Eventually, the clouds did dissipate and go away. And once that happened, what little the Germans have left was pounded. The Battle of the Bulge is a huge defeat. And when the Battle of the Bulge is over with, there's a feeling amongst U.S. Commanders that the Germans have made a huge mistake invading Germany is going to be that much easier now that they've wasted what little they have in this futile attack. So the Battle of the Bulge really did just sort of open Germany up to a massive invasion in 1945. It was just going to make it that much easier for the Allies to enter Germany and ultimately defeat it. Excuse me. So that when the spring did come, the ice began to melt, it stopped snowing. In the spring of 1945, the Allies did enter into Germany. Again, you have the Americans and the British coming in from the west. You have the Russians coming in from the east. So that in 1945, it's all but over for Germany, as the Allied advance faces very little resistance in its march into Germany. Along the way, disaster would strike, as President Franklin Roosevelt will pass away on April the 12th, 1945. You can see this big headline from the Chicago Daily Tribune. President Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage. Tragically passed away here at the end of the war. And I think one of the real tragedies of it all is he didn't get to see the end of his hard work. He didn't get to see the end of World War II, which just had but a few months left. But unfortunately, President Roosevelt does pass away April the 12th, 1945. With his passing, Harry S. Truman, he's the other face here in the photograph on the newspaper. He's the guy to the right, if you will. But Harry Truman is now President of the United States, and Harry Truman has some big, big decisions to make in the ending of the war. Specifically, he is going to have to make some decisions about the atomic bomb that the nation's been developing throughout this war. It's not ready for use at that moment in April of 1945, but once the bomb is ready, Harry Truman's going to have to make that decision whether or not we use an atomic bomb in World War II. Kind of getting ahead of myself here, but that project was so top secret, the building of an atomic bomb, that even the Vice President of the United States didn't know that we had scientists out in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico, trying to invent an atomic bomb. So not only is Harry S. Truman being sworn in as president, he now has the weight of the world thrown in his shoulders, ending this war in Europe as well as in Asia. But as he's sworn in, he's also told, and oh, by the way, Mr. President, we're developing this massive weapon. We need to fill you in on the details here. So Truman will lead the country through what's left of World War II. Okay, by April of 1945, the Russians began to encircle Berlin. At that point, Hitler knew the game was up. He could daily hear the pounding of bombs up above. Hitler went underground. He went into a bunker. He and his top-level Nazis that were around him did. But every day, the Russians got closer and closer to where Hitler was. With each passing day, they were conquering sections of Berlin. And we grew up in the United States. We didn't grow up in Russia. But I promise you, if you grew up in Russia, you would know this photograph. It would be a very famous photograph for you. This is Russian soldiers planting the communist flag, the hammer and sickle flag, there in Berlin. And just look at Berlin itself. When the Russians got into Germany, they began to repay some of the carnage that the Germans had done to them back in 1941. You'll remember the SS we talked about, rounding up people, just wholesale murder of what they considered to be subhumans. So when the Russians went into Germany, it wasn't just winning the war, it was repaying the atrocities that had happened back in 1941. So yeah, they just leveled Berlin to the ground. They didn't really bother with trying to preserve the city at all. The Russians just devastated Berlin and just leveled her to the ground. Well, realizing that it was all but over, on April the 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. There'd always be speculation that Hitler was still alive after the war. Personally, I don't know how much more dead a man can be. Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule, then pulled the trigger on a pistol that he had in his mouth. So, pistol to the head, cyanide capsule. Then, when all that was done, one of Hitler's personal assistants was told, to take his body out back, douse it in gasoline and burn it, and then douse it in gasoline and burn it again. So honestly, I don't know how much more dead a man can be than that. But I think the speculation was there because there never really was a body that could be identified. There never was a sort of a closure, I guess, if you will. But yes, on April the 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide. It wasn't just him. A lot of the top level Nazi guys around him also drank poison drinks, cyanide capsules, and things like that. And so you figure Hitler being dead is a good thing, right? That the war itself is coming to an end. But actually, what happened was confusion reigned in Germany, and nobody really knew who was in charge. Hitler didn't necessarily leave a note saying, "Hey, now that I'm gone, this person is now the leader of Germany." Hitler never left those sort of instructions. So the fighting continues for like a solid week more, and Hitler's dead, but there's no one really knowing who's in charge, who can surrender. But then finally, on May the 7th, 1945, a German admiral by the name of Dönitz, and for those of you who care, that's Doenitz, Admiral Karl Dönitz, finally steps up and says, you know what, I take leadership, I'll make the call. And on May the 7th, 1945, Karl Dönitz will surrender all German forces to the Allied powers. So it's referred to as VE Day, or Victory Europe Day, which is May the 7th, 1945. And with that, you have the surrender of Germany. The fighting in Europe itself comes to an end. So there was a massive celebration across the world on May the 7th, 1945, as the Germans do surrender. On the left, you can see we've got some celebration in London. On the right, you have even more celebrating in New York in the United States. So yes, Victory Europe, or VE Day, was a moment to celebrate. It was a reason to celebrate the party. But after those parties were over with, a lot of folks woke up with a hangover, I guess, the next day, and realized that the war itself was not over. That even though Germany was defeated, there was still a lot of fighting still to be had in the Pacific. So now let's look at ending the war in the Pacific and American victories over there. Now I'm really going to ask you to rely on your outline a lot because I've got some maps and photographs and things like that we're going to go through. But winning the war in the Pacific, really more than anything, was about the United States Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. Now, that shouldn't take away from any of the other military assets that were used by the United States in fighting in the Pacific, but it's a massive ocean, it's a lot of islands, and the United States really decided to take this approach of coming in from the South Pacific. If we look at our map here, and you look at the far right-hand side, sort of down to the bottom, and you can see Tarawa, this number 1, November 43, the Battle at Tarawa. What the United States tried to do was sweep in from the south, and then from the south head north towards Japan. Now, there was a lot of strategy involved with that decision. For one thing, coming in from the south could sort of link the United States to Australia, which barely makes our map here. You can just see but a touch of Australia down there. But the people of Australia were helping the United States in fighting this war. The idea was to sort of keep supply lines open between Australia and the United States. So that's one reason for coming in from the south, was to keep a supply line open between the United States and Australia. But also, you can do what's called island hopping. You can go attack a place like Tarawa, for example. Then you could skip a whole series of islands and go towards the next objective. And so the United States was just sort of hopping across these islands across the South Pacific, and eventually it would lead to the door of Japan. Now, two big islands that will be captured by the United States in this approach are the islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And let's see here, if we look on our map, they're numbers 11 and 12. Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. And you'll notice that they're really small. Okinawa, you can kind of see, is like a little speck on the map. Iwo Jima is so small, it's not even a speck. It's just this tiny little island out there in the Pacific. But the fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa in particular was very, very heavy. The closer the United States got to Japan, the harder the fighting became, the more dug in Japanese troops became. And by capturing Iwo Jima in particular, the United States found out some truths in the fighting to come. First of all, what we found out at Iwo Jima was the Japanese were dug in and willing to fight to the death. By this point, by the spring of 1945, the Japanese are carrying out what are called kamikaze attacks. Japanese fighter pilots are committing acts of suicide. They're literally running their aircraft into American ships, battleships, aircraft carriers, things like that. On the island of Iwo Jima itself, Japanese soldiers are fighting to the death. They refuse to surrender. They refuse to be taken prisoner. And Japanese culture at that time, it was believed that if you died in honor of the empire, if you died in the name of the emperor and sort of defending the empire of Japan, that when you went to the afterlife, you would be given a hero's welcome. You would be given all kinds of blessings and things because you died for the honor of the empire. So yeah, the Japanese would rather fight to the death than be taken prisoner here in this war. There's this really horrific scene that plays out in Okinawa, for example, where the fighting was over with. The Americans had taken the island, and U.S. soldiers were going to this little village in Okinawa to give some food and supplies to families. There were some women and children there in Okinawa, and the American soldiers were not there to hurt anyone. They were bringing them food. They were trying to make sure they were okay. And a lot of these Japanese women living on Okinawa, rather than accept the supplies, and they thought they were being taken prisoner, a lot of these women grabbed their children and ran off the side of cliffs, left to their deaths, rather than be taken prisoner by U.S. soldiers. It's really tragic. They weren't there to take prisoners. They were just there to offer them food and supplies. But again, you have that ingrained, that mentality. Don't be taken prisoner. It's better to die for the empire than to be held as a captive. So the fighting in Okinawa and Iwo Jima was intense. But once those two islands were captured, that meant that U.S. bombers, primarily B-29s, B-29 Liberators that were being used during the war, but at that point, that meant that Japan itself was in range of what's known as strategic bombing. At that point, our heavy bombers can use Okinawa and Iwo Jima as an air base. We can launch our bombers from those airfields on those two islands, and we can just do nonstop, round-the-clock bombardments of Japan at that point. So one big reason why Okinawa and Iwo Jima matter is Japan is within bomber range of U.S. bombers. But Iwo Jima and Okinawa also taught us something else as well. Here's raising the flag at Mount Suribachi in Iwo Jima. That's an iconic photograph there. There's a statue in Washington, D.C. That looks exactly like this photograph, those men raising the flag, excuse me, at Mount Suribachi. But I'm looking at this New York Times headline, and it says Okinawa is ours after 82 days. That's roughly 3 months of fighting for a little speck of an island in the Pacific. It took 3 months to capture that little bitty tiny island. And you can see here 45,000 U.S. casualties. It'd actually be higher than that once they got the real estimates in. And you can see Japan, 94,000 casualties. That again would also be higher. But it's going to take some 60,000 American Marines dying, U.S. casualties dying at Okinawa to capture that island. Again, that little island is a speck on the map. You can see here in the newspaper printout, you can see where the flag is and the capturing of Okinawa down there. Then look at Japan and look at how big Japan is. So if it costs that many lives, 3 months, that many U.S. casualties to capture Okinawa, the question being asked heading into the summer of 1945 is how many Americans will have to die to take Japan itself? If we invade the Japanese islands, how many American casualties will we have? And also, not only American casualties, but if 100,000 Japanese casualties took place at little old Okinawa, the question is how many Japanese people will die if we attack Japan as well. Japan itself is getting ready for the final assault. The Japanese people are being talked to about being a martyr, sacrificing their lives for the empire. We didn't know this at the time, but after the war, we found that all along the coast of Japan, there were these little submarines that had been set up. And these little submarines were set up to where one person could get in there. And it kind of ran like a bicycle, like you would pedal this thing out into the water. It's underwater the whole time. But basically, these little Japanese submarines were going to be used for kamikaze attacks. That one individual could sort of, get that thing out into the water, bring that sub up alongside, say, an American battleship, and then you would detonate a device, a bomb would go off, and it'd put a hole in the side of an American ship. So their coastline was dotted with those kamikaze subs. Their fighter pilots were preparing themselves for martyrdom. And when the military talked to President Truman about the possibility of invading the Japanese islands, Roosevelt, we're on to Truman now. President Truman was being told that it would take a minimum of 1 million American lives to capture the islands of Japan. Now, those estimates have always been very controversial. People look back and say, no, they were inflating their numbers. It wouldn't have taken that many American casualties. Who knows? But that's the information the president is working with. That to attack and capture the Japanese islands, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take at least 1 million American casualties. And God help us, the millions of Japanese people who will die in the invasion as well. The Japanese population would just be decimated by an American invasion. So, on the one hand, the capture of Okinawa and Iwo Jima show us, put us within bomber range of Japan. But just as important, capturing those islands just gives us the stark reality of how brutal fighting is in the Pacific, of how brutal fighting an enemy like Japan is. So President Truman is not looking forward to the idea of 1 million American casualties to take the islands of Japan. And as it turns out, there was an alternative. Looking at your outline, I'm looking at the Manhattan Project now. And throughout the war, at least once America got involved in the war, the United States began to put a lot of resources and a lot of scientific effort into developing an atomic bomb. Now, one of the big pushes here in trying to make an atomic bomb was the belief that the Germans were way ahead in this project. A lot of scientists in Europe were getting out as their countries were falling into Nazi hands. Albert Einstein, in particular, for example, he fled Europe as the Nazis were tearing across Europe. And Einstein, in particular, told President Roosevelt that the Germans were working on an atomic device. The belief was that the Germans were well ahead in their research of what it would take to make an atomic device. But what we didn't know, and it's not like the Germans put out a news release or anything, is yes, the Germans did look into the possibilities of making an atomic bomb. And truth be told, they had even begun like the basic beginning steps of what you would need to create an atomic bomb. But the Germans completely scuttled or gave up on their effort to build such a bomb. What the Germans ran into was the realization of how much money it would cost to develop an atomic device. And one can't help but shudder and think, they developed V-2 rockets. What if you put an atomic device on top of a V-2 rocket? Man, at that point, you don't have to worry about accuracy. Just, get it somewhere close to London, let one of those things go off, and it would just be a cataclysmic event. So fortunately for the human race, not just for the Allied powers, but the human race, Hitler did not go forward with the invention of an atomic bomb. But that did drive this U.S. effort. I mean, the Americans spent well over $1 billion. It took a good 3.5 solid years to develop an atomic bomb. And what drove the American effort the whole time was we have to do this before the Germans figure it out. We have to have the bomb first. All right. Well, you can see here in this collage of pictures. There on the bottom left-hand side, that's the first atomic device to be detonated in human history. I don't know what that guy's smiling about as he stands next to the thing. But you know, they hoisted it up into this tower. Um, the countdown goes off, 3, 2, 1. And here you can see on July 16th, 1945, on the right-hand side, this is the detonation of the first atomic device in human history. And I often go off on this rant. Here's a little side note to this. There are people who say that the United States didn't use the bomb against Germany for racist reasons. That the United States only used the bomb against the Japanese because of racism. Yeah, the problem with that line of thinking is Germany surrendered on May the 7th, 1945. There was no need to use an atomic bomb in Germany in July of 1945 because, well, Germany had surrendered roughly 2 months before. So it would be downright evil to drop an atomic bomb on Berlin when the Germans had surrendered 2 months before. So really the reason why the United States only used an atomic bomb on Japan is because Japan had not surrendered. Germany had surrendered 2 months before. Anyway, sorry to get derailed there. To get back on topic here, though, the United States now has an atomic bomb. We now have the destructive power of essentially the sun in these devices. Okay, so armed with that information, President Truman at that moment, July 1945, is in Potsdam. Here's another one of our big World War II conferences. This time, this one will be at Potsdam. The fellow on the far left, Clement Attlee, is the Prime Minister of England. Again, Churchill got voted out there at the end, poor guy. We have Truman there in the middle as Franklin Roosevelt died of a brain hemorrhage. Vice President Truman becoming president. Stalin is still there, though, the dictator, the leader of the Soviet Union. So now we have our new big three. And the whole point of the Potsdam Conference was to discuss how to end the war against Japan. These three gentlemen, along with other Allied power leaders, but these are the big three, they're meeting at Potsdam to consider all possibilities for ending the war in Asia and the fighting against the Japanese. Well, there's this moment at Potsdam where everyone's sitting around a table talking, and an aide comes up to President Truman, leans in and whispers in his ear a coded phrase, "The baby is born." And what that meant, "the baby is born," what it meant was we've tested the atomic bomb. It does work. It is something that we can use if we want to. Once Truman was given that coded message that the bomb works, it's tested, it works, he immediately stood up. He addressed all the Allied nations there around the table at Potsdam. And President Truman basically explained, we have this weapon. This is what it's capable of. And he put it to the Allied powers, this question, should we use this weapon to stop the fighting, to end World War II? I'm not trying to sugarcoat this. I'm not trying to forgive America at all. But at Potsdam, the Allied powers unanimously did agree that this weapon could be used to stop the fighting in Asia, to end the war against the Japanese. So, yes, the Allies say we could use this weapon, but at the end of the day, it is President Truman's decision whether or not to use the bomb. He has this horrible decision that has to be made of whether or not to drop an atomic bomb. Now, President Truman's thinking in dropping the bomb, he's got a few things going on here in his mind. I guess the first thing that's going on in his mind is saving American lives. I hate to be blunt and brutal with the statement, but he's president of the United States. He's not president of the world. And it would save American lives. Instead of invading Japan and losing 1 million American lives, You can drop this bomb, maybe a second bomb, and you don't lose any American lives in the process. So number one, dropping the bomb would save American lives. And number two, this is very blunt, but it's true as well. It would save Japanese lives as well. I mean, if your options are to go through with an invasion, anyways. Now, there are some people who criticize these moments and say, well, all you had to do was blockade Japan. Just put up a massive quarantine of Japan, if you will. Don't let anything get in or get out. Yeah, but at that point, you're going to have people in Japan starving to death. Also, I promise you the Japanese would have come out and attacked those American ships, would have committed kamikaze assaults against them. So you could sit it out. You could do this blockade effort, but that's going to cause starvation, hunger, and chaos in Japan as well. So realistically, your options are drop this bomb or invade. If America goes through with the invasion, again, not only he's being told the loss of 1 million American lives, but how many more millions of Japanese people would have died as well in those attacks? Like, this is one of those classic cases of there's not a right decision. Decision A, decision B, a lot of people are going to die. It's one of those decisions that sometimes presidents have to make where it's a tough decision. Whatever decision you make, it's going to be an awful end and an awful outcome. But in option A, Truman could have American forces invade Japan and lose millions of lives. Or in option B, he could drop one of these bombs and say 100,000 people die in a Japanese city. Need be, he has to drop a second device, roughly another 100,000 people die. So you could have some 200,000 deaths versus millions dead. So again, one reason for dropping the bomb was to save American lives, but it was also rationale that it would also save a lot of Japanese lives in the process as well. Another thing that was in his thinking about dropping the bomb was it would be a show of force to the Russians that we have this weapon and this is what it's capable of. Truman met Stalin for the first time there at Potsdam, and he came away with a sick feeling about Stalin. He said, I don't trust him at all. He didn't like Stalin in the meeting that they had at Potsdam. So Truman is thinking this also will show the Soviet Union, hey, you should think twice before you cross us. We already recognize you're becoming a problem at the end of this war. You're probably going to be a problem when this war is over with as well. So yes, this is a weapon that we have, and it's something that could be used. So again, another reason for dropping the bomb was this idea of a show of force to the Russians, that this is a weapon that we have, and this is what it's capable of. Truman did wrestle with this decision. It was not an easy decision. It was something that he thought about. He constantly went back and forth on, weighing the different options. But Harry Truman did decide to drop an atomic bomb. He did decide to use this weapon. And he said that once he made the decision, he slept better than he'd ever slept in his life. Now, in the days leading up to the decision, he wasn't sleeping very good at all. But he said that once he made the decision, he had the best night's rest that he'd ever had. And he would also say that he dropped this bomb because he didn't want to have to look American mothers in the eyes and tell them that their son might still be here if he had used this device. So, at the end of the day, it was about saving American lives. The military would also argue it would save Japanese lives. And dropping the bomb was also a show of force to the Soviet Union of this weapon that America had. So on August the 6th, 1945, a U.S. bomber, the Enola Gay, took off, flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and that it's Hiroshima is it's really a sad fate for that city. The U.S. military chose Hiroshima because it was a city that was relatively intact at that point. It hadn't been necessarily hit hard by previous bombing raids by the American Army Air Force. What the military wanted was an intact target, if you will, so that when the atomic bomb went off, they would know that this damage was caused by that bomb and not previous bomb raids. So just this horrible fate of Hiroshima, that's why she's chosen, is she's a quote, in using military terms, they're a quote clean target that didn't have a lot of damage. But you can see here in this photograph, this is the aftermath of the dropping of the atomic bomb. Just in that moment when it goes off, roughly 80,000 people living in Hiroshima are killed. Over the next few weeks, leading into like months, but 6 weeks plus later, some 20,000 more Japanese people in the area would die from exposure to radiation poisoning, and things like that. So in all, we say that the dropping of the atomic bomb at Hiroshima kills roughly 100,000 to 120,000 people living in Hiroshima and the vicinity of Hiroshima. The Japanese themselves could not believe that one bomb did this much damage. The Japanese were stunned. The Japanese believed that their radar just didn't pick up the attack, that there was more than just a bomber used in this assault. The Japanese just could not believe that there was a super weapon, that this one bomb could cause that much destruction. So rather than surrender after the dropping of the bomb at Hiroshima, the Japanese vowed to fight on. They vowed to fight to the death. And really, after Hiroshima, they just sort of dug in harder rather than contemplate surrender. So at that point, the Americans realized that this war had but days left. The Russians began to realize that this war had but days left. The Russians did realize that the Americans would continue to drop atomic bombs, that at some point the Japanese would surrender. And so after the bomb at Hiroshima was detonated, a couple of days later, the Russians began to attack into northern China. This Russian attack would not only go through northern China, it would also go through the northern parts of Korea as well. So the Russians went on a bit of a land grab here at the end of World War II, and their forces would push into northern China as well as into North Korea. And that is so going to matter in things to come. The fact that communist Russia is in China, and the fact that communist Russia is in North Korea, because as the war comes to an end, the Russians won't give up those areas. They will back communist states in China as well as a communist state in North Korea going forward. All right, well, looking now at Nagasaki. So the United States decided to drop a second device on August the 9th. The first device did not force the Japanese to surrender. So the second device will hit just a few days later on August the 9th, 1945. Here's what Nagasaki looks like after the device goes off. Again, in the aftermath of the Nagasaki attack, roughly another 100,000 people died with the dropping of the bomb at Nagasaki. So after the detonation of a device at Nagasaki, the Japanese realized there really is a super weapon. We can't lose our cities every 2 to 3 days like this. So the Japanese at that point began to talk about the possibility of surrender. They contact the Allied forces. They were trying to negotiate certain terms of their surrender. For example, they wanted the Emperor of Japan to be able to stay on the throne and continue to control the country. But the United States, the other Allied powers, said, look, it's an unconditional surrender. You can't set the terms. All you can do is surrender, and we tell you what happens going forward. So there was some back and forth. There were some negotiations that took place. But finally, on August the 14th, 1945, the Japanese do surrender, and that's known as VJ Day, Victory Japan Day, on August the 14th, 1945. On that day, the Emperor of Japan addressed his people via the radio, and that was the first time that the people of Japan had ever heard their emperor speak. Victory Japan Day. He addressed the nation of Japan and told them that they had fought with honor, that he was proud of them, but that it was time to lay down their weapons. It was time to stop the fighting and end the war. So with VJ Day, you have this massive celebration that touches off across planet Earth. Here you can see on the left-hand side the famous photograph of the sailor kissing the nurse in Times Square. On the right-hand side, the headline says it all, we have peace. So with Victory Japan Day, you really can celebrate, you really can let loose. It's all over with the surrender of the Japanese on August 14th, 1945. Just to make it all official, the Articles of Surrender. This is our last point for World War II. The Articles of Surrender will be signed on September the 2nd, 1945, and those will be signed in Tokyo Harbor aboard a U.S. battleship, the USS Missouri. All the major nations that were involved in World War II will gather aboard that ship. They will all sign these Articles of Surrender. Basically, it states that the war is over. The Germans had really already surrendered, but they're there to sign the articles. The Japanese, they are there to sign those Articles of Surrender as well. So that if this war started on September the 1st, 1939, 6 years and 1 day later, it comes to an end on September the 2nd, 1945, in Tokyo, with the signing of the Articles of Surrender. With this war over, Japan has a lot of devastation and ruin. Asia is going to have to be rebuilt. Not just Japan, but China, Korea, and places like that. But also in Europe, there's a lot of devastation and destruction as well. England, France, Germany, Italy, these nations are going to have to rebuild in the aftermath of the Great War. So Europe lies in devastation and destruction. Parts of Asia do as well. And what we say is, coming out of World War II, you have this rise of the superpowers, the continental superpowers. As the United States and the Soviet Union come out of this war the clear winners and the clear leaders of the planet going forward. The United States and the Soviet Union have been allies during this war, had helped each other out in defeating Germany and ultimately Japan. But I've always put it this way: with the war over, and specifically with Hitler defeated, there really was nothing that could keep the United States and the Soviet Union together going forward. We have different styles of government. We have different styles of economic policy. Our view of the world is very different from the Soviet view. So yes, the two nations have been allies in winning World War II. But now that the war was over with, those bonds of friendship fell apart. That alliance just totally dissolves. And a Cold War breaks out as World War II is coming to an end. Again, the Cold War really did start at Yalta in February of 1945. So it's a strange thing of World War II comes to an end while the Cold War is beginning. And the Cold War was a war of ideas. It never was a hot war, thank God. I don't know that we would be here. I don't know that you'd be listening to me lecture right now if it had gone hot. But the Cold War was a war of ideas. And it basically was a war of, is the American way better or is the Russian Soviet Union way better? So yes, the Cold War will emerge after World War II. Okay, well, if we were on campus and if we were in the classroom, I would tell you guys to sort of get into review mode